What if I told you that even the most radical revolutionaries are still trapped, not by chains or prisons, but by their own beliefs? Their loyalty to abstractions keep them in invisible bondage. At least this is what 19th century philosopher Max Stirner said when he was critiquing his contemporaries and their great ideas for better coexistence. Today, we're looking into Stirner's critique of leftism, including leftist anarchism and post-left anarchism, straight from his work, The Ego on Its Own. First, quickly, let's remind the ones who are new here who Max Stirner is and what his involvement in the revolutionary political narrative is. So, Max Stirner was a philosopher and an active participant in the intellectual and revolutionary scene of his time. He engaged with the radical movement of 19th century Europe. He was also a former member of the Young Hegelians, the intellectuals who had studied under Hegel and were developing their own concepts and theories around revolutionary thought. Basically, Stirner's critique of Hegelian philosophy and political ideologies like socialism positioned him as a provocative figure within the leftist revolutionary circles, even though his ideas, which emphasized individual autonomy or egoism, were in direct contrast to the collective notions of liberation espoused by figures like Karl Marx. Stirner rejected the notion of any higher moral or political authority, which made his work appealing to those who sought to break free from conventional structures, but other aspects of his thought put him at odds with the more collectivist elements of the revolutionary movement. Basically, Stirner believed that individual self-interest and therefore personal liberation was necessary for real change. However, to do that, this idea of change had to be ignored, and the fundamental aspects of any and all personal aspirations had to be deconstructed. Because otherwise, if the authenticity thing was lacking, it just wasn't going to work, according to Stirner. So Stirner's focus wasn't to change material conditions, nor was it a change of thought and belief structures. For Stirner, everything started with the individual. So let's look at this more closely. Max Stirner didn't just critique authority in the conventional sense. His critique wasn't just aimed at the state, religion, or traditional power structures. He also turned his gaze on the very movement that sought to overthrow them, so the left. Now you might wonder, why target the left? Aren't they the ones advocating for freedom, equality, and sometimes even a society without rulers? Well, Stirner's answer is simple. The left, even in its more radical forms, is just another form of ideological control, and it often manages to make people believe otherwise, which is what makes it so dangerous. In The Ego on Its Own, Stirner argues that leftist ideologies claim to free the individual, but end up imposing a new form of spook. And as we know, for Stirner, a spook isn't a ghost or a supernatural being. It's an idea or abstraction that possesses the mind and commands loyalty and obedience as though it were real. These spooks, which are ideas like justice or the people or freedom or equality, are revered as higher values, and yet they are nothing but constructs that shape the collective consciousness unless they come from a place of true desire and authenticity, according to Stirner. So the left, in its desire to create a new, more just world, often demands a sacrifice of individuality. Instead of simply overturning the existing order, it replaces the old ideals with new ones, ideals that, for Stirner, are just as oppressive. In this way, leftist movements can become just as authoritarian as the structures they seek to abolish, because they impose their own moral codes on individuals. Stirner doesn't deny the need for change. He's actually deeply interested in revolution, but he insists that true change must begin with the individual, not with an abstract collective ideal. To Stirner, the left's focus on the collective is the real issue. It elevates the group, the cause, or the collective good above the unique individual. So then the person is sacrificed for the sake of an ideal, whether that ideal is the people, the state, or revolution. So the left's obsession with abstract ideals like social justice or equality means they often forget the core issue, which is individual autonomy, according to Stirner. Stirner's critique, then, is aimed not just at the structures of power, but at the very way in which we allow abstract ideas to govern us. This means that the real issue here is authenticity. Stirner believes that authentic desire is the fundamental condition for any real change. change. But if you are caught in an ideal that imposes a kind of you that isn't authentically you, you will either be forced to conform or rebel against this demand, which will ultimately turn you sour in a way. It will create a tension between what Lacan would call your real and the symbolic order. And this just isn't going to work. In his work, Stirner has called leftism a new religion. This might sound strange at first, but it's a crucial part of Stirner's argument. You see, Stirner believed that leftist movements don't just fight to dismantle existing power structures. They create a new system of beliefs and idols that, rather than freeing the individual, reintroduce a different kind of enslavement. In his work, he uses the idea of humanity to illustrate this point. For Stirner, the concept of humanity, much like the state, is a spook, a constructed ideal that binds individuals to something greater than themselves, a collective identity that demands sacrifice and submission. Leftist ideologies, by elevating such abstract ideals as equality or social justice to a moral imperative, sometimes unknowingly impose new forms of obligation on the individual. In Stirner's view, these movements often replace one kind of oppression with another, where instead of a king or a ruler, the individual now answers to the greater good of the collective, surrendering their autonomy to a new set of norms and expectations. So in a way, humanity becomes the new God. Stirner argues that leftism, despite its claims to oppose hierarchy and authority, often elevates abstract ideas to the status of an unquestionable truth, much like religion does. Just like religious dogma, leftist ideologies demand faith and allegiance to higher ideals. But these ideals, whether it's equality, justice, or revolution, aren't actually real. They don't exist outside of our minds, but they command our devotion as though they were sacred truths. In this sense, Stirner sees leftist ideologies as a form of religious faith. Just as religion often demands submission to abstract concepts like God or the soul, leftism demands submission to concepts like the people, justice, or revolution. These abstract ideals are worship, and the individual is expected to subjugate themselves for the sake of these ideals. But in any case, it's important to note that Stirner doesn't oppose collective action in itself. He's not saying that people shouldn't work together or form alliances. What he opposes is the elevation of the collective over the individual, because, well, he just doesn't think it will work. So for Stirner, these ideologies aren't just false, they're illusions. They are phantoms that take on a life of their own. The reality is that these causes don't exist independently of the people who give them meaning. The individual once again becomes lost in the worship of spooks. But let's go even deeper and look not just at leftism, but leftist anarchism, so those who are interested also in abolishing the state, capitalism, and social inequality altogether, and are willing to go a little further in their actions. Leftist anarchism advocates for a society where individuals freely associate, and where they are unrestrained by coercive systems. Sounds all peachy, but to Stirner, this vision is far from the true liberation that it claims to be. Instead, he believes that this kind of concept still falls prey to the same fundamental error as other forms of leftism, the elevation of coercive ideals over the individual. For Stirner, anarchism's vision of a stateless society isn't the problem at all. What's problematic is that even in this kind of an anarchist environment, the individual is still expected to sacrifice themselves for the collective good, whether it's the people, the community, or the revolution. Even though anarchism rejects the state, it still constructs a new kind of moral order that demands allegiance to ideals like equality, justice, or solidarity. Stirner also isn't necessarily against the idea of voluntary associations or communities. Rather, he's against the notion that these associations should serve a collective ideal that overrides individual autonomy. For him, the anarchist who submits himself to the cause of the people or the revolution is just as enslaved as someone serving under a king or a government. These ideals, these spooks, still have the power to control the individual, whether or not they're clothed in the language of liberation. So what Stirner proposes instead is a radical form of individual autonomy where no one is required to sacrifice themselves for any collective cause. He insists that true freedom comes from the rejection of all these abstractions. So to Stirner, even the most radical anarchists are trapped by their devotion to lofty ideals. While they reject external rulers, they unknowingly create new internal internal ones. These internal rulers take on the role of oppressors, and they demand that the individual conform to their dictates. Even in a stateless society, the individual isn't truly free if they're bound by the chains of abstract ideals. So the bottom line for Stirner is pretty clear. Anarchism on the left, like all leftist movements, fails to liberate the individual, and the true path to liberation isn't the destruction of the state alone, but in the destruction of spooks. And without this, any revolution, anarchist or otherwise, is doomed to repeat the same mistake: the creation of a new authority that subjugates the individual in the name of a higher cause. Now let's look at the more contemporary movement of post-left anarchism and see if Stirner aligns more here. Post-left anarchism is a form of anarchist thought that emerged in the late 20th century, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. It emerged as a critique of traditional leftist anarchism. Basically, it rejects both the hierarchical structures of the state and the rigid dogmatic elements within leftist political ideologies. So that sounds pretty good. Post-left anarchism seeks to move beyond the conventional left-right political spectrum, and it critiques the ways in which traditional leftist movements, including anarchism, can become ideological, moralistic, and authoritarian in their pursuit of equality, justice, and revolution. So first, we have the rejection of ideological orthodoxy. So post-left anarchists criticize the tendency within traditional anarchism and leftism to impose abstract ideals as ultimate goals. They argue that these ideals can become authoritarian in nature when they demand absolute allegiance and subjugate individual desires in favor of collective causes. So in this way, post-left anarchism aligns somewhat with Stirner's critique of abstract ideals, which views them as spooks that can limit true individual autonomy. The second characteristic is anti-politics. So post-left anarchism often rejects the traditional notion of politics itself and views it as an extension of the state or a mechanism that still reinforces the social order. Instead of engaging in formal political struggles, post-left anarchists emphasize the importance of creating alternative ways of living and organizing outside of state structures. They argue that political movements, even if aiming for liberation, can become co-opted by power dynamics and ideological constraints. The third characteristic is the focus on autonomy and self-realization. So post-left anarchists place a strong emphasis on individual autonomy and self-realization. They criticize leftist movements for often subordinating personal freedom and creativity to the collective or ideological causes. Instead, they advocate for a more fluid and decentralized approach to anarchism that prioritizes the free expression of individuals and the rejection of fixed roles or identities. Another characteristic is its critique of revolution and the utopian ideal. So post-left anarchism challenges the traditional anarchist or leftist idea that a revolution or a societal upheaval is necessary to achieve liberation. Rather than waiting for a future or idealized society to emerge, post-left anarchists focus on creating moments of resistance and individual freedom in the present. So they question the efficacy of long-term, large-scale revolutionary projects, and they often see them as prone to creating new forms of authority. And the last characteristic is its influence of post-structuralism and anti-capitalism. So post-left anarchism draws heavily on post-structuralist and anti-capitalist ideas, particularly from thinkers like Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari. These philosophers focus on the ways in which power operates in subtle and decentralized ways throughout society, and they challenge traditional ideas of revolution and class struggle. So post-left anarchists often advocate for forms of resistance that are more decentralized, more subtle, and more creative. And our boy Stirner is often seen as a forerunner for post-left anarchism. But is it the same? Well, let's see. Stirner's philosophy aligns with post-left anarchism in several key ways, yes. In particular, in its rejection of abstract ideals and collective submission. Both Stirner and post-left anarchism critique the elevation of ideals like the people, justice, and revolution as spooks. And Stirner argues that these concepts become authoritative, just as post-left anarchism critiques the ways these ideals can become authoritarian, even within anti-authoritarian movements. Both also prioritized individual autonomy over ideological commitment, with Stirner emphasizing personal freedom and egoistic self-interest, which resonates with post-left anarchism's critique of movements that subjugate the individual to collective goals. Additionally, Stirner's anti-revolutionary stance, which rejects traditional revolutionary action in favor of rejecting all external authority in the present, also aligns with post-left anarchism's focus on localized immediate forms of resistance. And Stirner also critiques political movements as co-opted by power dynamics, which is a view that mirrors post-left anarchism's skepticism toward formal political engagement. However, and this is the important part, Stirner deviates from this type of anarchism in one aspect: his warning of rebellion. So he warns that rebellion, even in the name of anti-authoritarianism or in an attempt to deconstruct spooks, can become a problem in itself because it often leads to the creation of new forms of submission, just like conformity does. His egoism, instead, compels him to reject any form of practice that isn't determined by his own will. And there's a strict practice involved here. For Stirner, it is imperative to first deeply understand one's own intentions and the intentions of others, not just through deconstruction, but also through deep self-reflection, before any kind of practice to liberate oneself can actually be developed, and most certainly before any collective or cultural liberation can be achieved. This is where Lacan's theory of the real and the symbolic offers a useful framework for understanding the limitations of post-left anarchism, especially when analyzed through the lens of Stirner's philosophy. So, Lacan's distinction between the real and the symbolic speaks to the tension between what is unspeakable or unsymbolizable and the system of signifiers, language, and social order. The symbolic represents the domain of meaning, language, culture, and identity, where individuals are constantly structured by societal norms, codes, and ideologies. The real, by contrast, is the register of that which escapes symbolization and representation. So it's inarticulable. It's the raw force of the world that can't be fully integrated into the structures of language and society. In Lacanian terms, the real is outside of the symbolic, but it nonetheless exerts a powerful influence on it because the subject constantly grapples with its presence through the limits of language and the gaps in signification. And when we apply this to Stirner's philosophy, we see that his individualism and his form of self-expression, his insistence on the uniqueness and the irreducibility of the self, aligns with Lacan's notion of the real. Stirner's philosophy, like Lacan's real, resists totalization and symbolization within any broader ideological system, and any attempt to universalize or systematize Stirner's thought, like integrating it into a political ideology, would turn it into a spook. So Stirner's philosophy operates within the realm of personal individual ownness, and this is something he continuously focuses on by rejecting any attempt to translate it into the language of the symbolic. But now you're probably thinking, okay, but didn't Stirner also write a book about this? Like, how is it any different? Well, Stirner's work isn't really a philosophical exploration. In its language, in its literary approach, it's a radical personal expression of the individual's confrontation with societal norms and the structures of power. I actually wrote a conference paper about this for the second annual Max Stirner Symposium. You're welcome to have a look at that. I will link it in the description. But in any case, his writing is intentionally fragmented, irreverent, and almost confrontational in its refusal to submit to any overarching system, whether political, religious, or ideological. This isn't just a critique of authority, it's a lived, subjective experience of liberation, one that resists being encapsulated by the language or the theory. So Stirner's focus is on the singular, unique individual that is him. And this is what makes his work deeply personal. It doesn't aim to create a blueprint or a system for any other person to follow. His work is more like a mirror for the reader or a reflection of their own struggle with external forces, but not something that can be codified or replicated in a collective sense. even though people have tried to do that for a long time. So in contrast, post-left anarchism, like any ism that accepts its ismness, seeks to structure a worldview around certain principles, concepts, and language, and that is the problem. It takes liberatory ideas and tries to translate them into a shared language or a social practice. And in doing so, it risks transforming those ideas into a concept or a system that can be implemented, followed, and ultimately institutionalized. This process of speaking something into language is dangerous because it creates a universal framework that can be adopted by others. And in doing so, it loses the immediate, raw, and personal freedom that Stirner emphasizes. It becomes something external to the individual rather than a deeply personal experience of self-ownership. So when post-left anarchism speaks of things like freedom, autonomy, or non-hierarchy, these terms, once introduced into language and society, can be co-opted and diluted and institutionalized, which will directly affect post-anarchism. So the moment you can name something, write about it, or pass it on to others, it risks becoming an object or a structure, something that's no longer personal, but rather something imposed upon the individual. And Stirner didn't call egoism. So, Stirner's philosophy operates within the realm of the personal individual ownness, and this is something he continuously focuses on by rejecting any attempt to translate it into the language of the symbolic. The moment a philosophy like post-left anarchism attempts to represent the real, personal experience of freedom within the confines of language or societal structures, like within the symbolic, it loses its force and becomes a spook. So egoism can't be advocacy. Stirner would probably argue that the promotion of such ideologies, whether post-left anarchism or any other system, is ultimately futile because the moment it's made into a universal concept, it becomes something that can be taken up and used as a tool for control or co-option. An example here is the concept of temporary autonomous zones, which was introduced by Hakim Bey. Temporary autonomous zones are about liberated spaces outside of the dominant social, political, or economic order. So while Stirner might initially appear sympathetic to the idea of autonomy, he would probably very quickly critique the idea that such spaces could actually be defined, maintained, or universally applicable, because the very notion of creating a good or ideal autonomous zone that could be replicated or spread would ultimately turn into a spook. So as soon as these zones become a generalized concept or ideal within language, it loses its uniqueness and becomes a tool for the symbolic order. So unlike post-left anarchism, which critiques social norms and strives for alternative social structures, Stirner sees these efforts as distractions from the ultimate goal of deep understanding of oneself and the world the ego is trapped in. He believes that rather than focusing on rebellion or resistance, the individual should prioritize their own autonomy and desires, and he acknowledges that this is an incredibly difficult but not impossible path, which is tied to a practice of consistent self-reflection and radical honesty with oneself. This demands a deep understanding of desire as a process that has the potential to own us. So, Stirner's focus on desire as the foundation for true, authentic uniqueness makes him, well, unique.